sense setting and how it shapes psychedelic experience, the more it shook my ideas about and my assumptions about psychedelics, about their effects. And thinking about psychedelics from the perspective of technology studies got me to think about how sense setting shapes psychedelic experiences, not just for individuals, but for entire cultures. And this research eventually led me to write this book, American Trip, which came out with MIT Press earlier this year. And I want to share with you today some of the key insights from the book. I'll be discussing the idea of cultural sense setting, how sense setting shape not just individual experiences with psychedelics, but in psychedelic experiences of entire culture. The idea that contrary to what we may think, the psychedelic experience is not a given. There is no one psychedelic experience. It's always specific, always related to culture and to society. And I'll also be talking about something that I call the paradox of sense setting, and how this paradox led me to think about three core psychedelic fundamentals, or in other words, three basic effects that underlie the entire spectacular diversity of psychedelic effects. And finally, I'll close off by just discussing what this all means for us as individuals and as societies, and how sense setting can inform drug policy and optimize drug experiences for large groups of people. So we have a lot of ground to cover. And I want to start off with the basic concept of sense setting. So I'm sure many of you encounter this concept of sense setting under one guide or another. So maybe you met the classic psychedelic aphorism that says, always do it at the right time, in the right place, with the right people. Easy to remember, not always very easy to act upon. And to be more precise, this concept of sense setting means that psychedelic substances, that their effects are not preordained and not predetermined, but they're shaped by other factors. And we're talking about two main types of factors. So first, we're talking about the internal factors, and that's set. What kind of expectations do I have before entering a psychedelic experience? What kind of intentions am I setting? What's my mood when I'm entering this journey? And the second type of factors are the environmental factors. So that's the setting. And basically, where am I taking these psychedelics? Is this happening in the woods, in a church, in a clinic, maybe in a party? Who am I taking it with? Am I surrounded by friends or by strangers? Maybe I'm alone. And finally, we have another level, which is the grander cultural context of the whole experience. So what does my culture tell me about the meaning of experiences with psychedelics, about the structure of reality? How do these cultural messages structure my experience with these compounds? What kind of frameworks do I have to make sense of my experience? Maybe my culture tells me that the psychedelic experiences are wrong, that I'm a bad person for seeking them out. Or alternatively, maybe my culture cherishes these experiences. Maybe it gives me tools to integrate them. So these things are crucial to the direction that a psychedelic experience takes. And basically, these principles are nothing new. So indigenous cultures are very aware that psychedelic experience is susceptible to cues, to suggestions, and shamans have a whole toolbox for directing experiences of their clients. They use ritual songs, they use smoke, they use whistles, sacred objects. So they know sense setting, but at the same time, interestingly, this realization concerning the crucialness of the setting has generally been absent from Western psychiatry in the past, perhaps even today to some extent. So when psychedelics first entered the scene, it took time for this idea to really sink in, and of just how responsive these tools are to context. And in American Trip, I dedicate a lot of time to cover the growth and the evolution of this idea in the 1950s, in the 1960s, leading all the way to this guy, Timothy Leary, who coined the term sense setting. So probably all of you know Leary, and Leary didn't invent anything new really. With sense setting, most of these ideas about sense setting were already explored by earlier writers that I cover in the book. But what he did add to the conversation was that he gave this idea a catchy name. He gave it a title that caught on, and he experimented with a wider variety of sets and settings than any other researcher. He gave psychedelics to graduate students and to high security prisoners. He gave them to Protestant ministers. He gave them to beat poets. He gave them in churches, in prisons, in faculty homes, in bohemian crash pads. He gave them in all of these very different environments to very different types of people with very different types of sense settings. And he also dedicated more theoretical attention to sense setting than anyone before. He popularized this idea in books like this one, The Psychedelic Experience, 1964. And this book includes the first popular discussion of sense setting. So today, many people know Leary as this controversial 1960s rogue scientist who turned LSD evangelist to cause damage to 1960s psychedelic science. So he's basically been a scapegoat for many years for a lot of people in the psychedelic research community. I want to suggest that if we want to look on the positive side, this is where Leary made his most vital, his most lasting contribution to the field of psychedelic science. So the cultivation and propagation of this idea of sense setting is where I think his legacy is redeemed. So the idea of sense setting remains crucial to psychedelic science. It's crucial to study the very wide range of effects that psychedelics elicit. So it's crucial for research, and it's also crucial for psychedelic therapy, for any attempt to optimize the effects of psychedelics. It's relevant for professionals, but it's also relevant for lay people, for psychonauts, for anybody that's interested in exploring psychedelics, and it's crucial to whatever we hope to get from these agents. So in American Trip, I look at 7 different schools of LSD research that existed in the 50s and 60s, all the way from CIA research to research on LSD and spirituality. And I show how the results of each of these different schools oscillated widely depending on the setting. So which kind of expectations and intentions researchers were bringing into their work, which kind of research environments they were creating, all of this was crucial. And each of these research schools, each of these 7 schools, created its own kind of microclimate for psychedelic experimentation. Each of them produced completely different results. So, for example, one group claimed that LSD is a cognitive disruptor. But then you had another group claiming it's a cognitive enhancer. One group claimed it induces psychosis. Another group claimed it heals the mind. One group said it's such a horrible experience, nobody ever wants to repeat it, ever. Then you had another group saying, we give it to people, they just keep coming back for more and telling all their friends about it. So when you read the reports of these different groups, it's like they're talking about completely different drugs. But while in reality, it was the result of different kinds of sense setting that each of these groups were creating, which brings me to the next issue or level for this discussion, which none of these environments existed in a vacuum. So if these research tools could be spotted as microclimates for scene setting, then all of these microclimates were nestled within the surrounding climates of psychology, of psychiatry, of science, of society, of culture. And this is a crucial point that stands at the center of my book, because we usually think about sense setting as something very specific, very individualistic. We think about specific people we were with during psychedelic experience, where we were at the time, what we had on our mind on that specific day, and how all of those factors came together to shape our experience. But really, I want to argue that none of this exists in a vacuum. Our individual sense setting always exists as part of a larger context. Basically, that's something that the psychedelic experience tells you up front. One of the key psychedelic insights, recurring psychedelic insights, is the idea that it's all connected, right? So that's something we need to keep in mind when we think about sense setting. It's all connected. And if you think about it, none of the key parameters of sense setting is separate from the surrounding culture. So your expectations and your intentions when you go into a psychedelic experience completely informed by what your culture tells you about these experiences. The people you're with, the physical environment, all of this obviously shaped by the culture of that you're part of. So really, our psychedelic experiences are quite intimately linked with the culture that we live in. So there are two levels of sense setting, and one level is the individual level, but it doesn't exist on itself. It sits on top of a broader, more fundamental level of collective sense setting. So back in the 50s, an anthropologist named Anthony Wallace wrote about the differences between different cultures and how they approach hallucinations. And he argued that these differences lead to different kinds of experiences with hallucinogens. So for example, he pointed to studies that show that there were huge differences in the effects of mescaline on white Americans who participated in clinical trials with mescaline and Native Americans who participated in peyote rituals with the Native American church. So the active agent in peyote is mescaline. It's the same substance. So you would think that the effects should be the same, but they weren't, not at all. And white people in clinical trials had mood swings. They became sexual or suspicious or aggressive. They had feelings of meaninglessness, loss of contact with reality. On the other hand, the participants in rituals of the Native American church had very different reactions. No mood swings, no aggression, no sexual behavior, no suspiciousness. Instead, they show this calm presence, full of awe, satisfaction, and instead of feeling out of touch with reality, they actually felt like they were contacting a higher order of reality that enhanced their sense of meaning. So the culture matters, and Wallace argued that because of the negative view that Western society has regarding hallucinations, people in the West are actually at a greater risk of having negative experiences with hallucinogens. And a decade later, in the late 1960s, the American government proved that Wallace was right. It started this campaign against psychedelics, and it turned out that the rate of bad trips blew up in a matter of a few short years. So you might know that the late 60s were a time when psychedelic users were heavily persecuted by law enforcement, and the press was filled with scare stories about psychedelics. So if you open the newspaper, you'd read that LSD causes chromosome damage, that it will turn your kids into mutants, that it fries your brain. And if you're crazy enough to take LSD, you'll probably jump out of the window. So people believed all of this stuff. And in this atmosphere, the risk of paranoia really skyrocketed. And if you look at the story of the 50s and 60s psychedelic culture, you can really see how the meaning of the psychedelic experience shifted. Suddenly, the idea of danger became strongly associated with psychedelics, and this changed people's very experiences with these drugs. So that's one example, the example of bad trips, of negative responses to psychedelics. But how else? How else do we see cultural ideas inform experiences with psychedelics? So basically, in American Trip, I look at several examples for this, for the ways that cultural trends of mid-20th century America informed psychedelic experience and how we think about it. And the first example I want to speak about is an example of sexuality. And in the 1960s, the psychedelic experience was highly sexualized. It basically had Timothy Leary telling the readers of Playboy that a woman on LSD will experience hundreds of orgasms. And he was saying, compared with sex on LSD, having sex with no LSD is like having sex with a department store dummy. So you had books with titles like The Sexual Paradise of LSD, LSD Orgy, and the general perception was that LSD opens the gate to this new world of liberated, polymorphous sexuality, a multidimensional sexuality that transcends square sexuality. It promised an exciting utopian eroticism. Well, how does this idea of erotic utopia enhanced by psychedelics correspond with experiences in other cultures? Well, it's not representative in any way, I can tell you that. And in most shamanic traditions, sex is a big no-no. Being sexually abstinent is a crucial part of the diet before entering the vision realms. Hallucinogenic religions are also quite sexually conservative. So the idea that LSD acts as an aphrodisiac is certainly not representative. And you can see how it's actually related to other cultural moments of the 1960s, like the sexual revolution. So the psychedelic experience is not inherently sexual, but this perception still shaped how people approach these types of psychedelic experiences in the 1960s and the types of experiences that they had. So what else? A second example I want to give is the theme of humanist universalist values. And over the past couple of years, we've seen studies that tie psychedelics together with liberal universalist values. Some of this stuff coming from Imperial College, some of it coming from Johns Hopkins, perhaps. And this line of research is clearly predicated on a long tradition that goes all the way to the 60s. And Paul McCartney, who in a 1967 interview said, well, if you give the leaders of the world LSD, they would banish war, poverty, and hunger immediately. So I'm sure we all know this line of reasoning. Just put acid in the water supply and everything will be all right. And in the 60s, when the peace movement was at its peak, this idea had very strong traction. So when poet Allen Ginsberg first ate psilocybin mushrooms in 1960, what did he do? He called the operator. He called and tried to arrange a conference call with Kennedy, with Chairman Mao, and with Nikita Khrushchev to bring world peace. So the general idea was that psychedelics elicit this experience of oneness, that once you have that experience, political disputes become irrelevant. The idea of violence becomes unthinkable. So again, very nice idea, but if you look at it from a cross-cultural perspective, you find that these universalist, peace-loving sentiments are not generally shared by all hallucinogenic cultures. So for example, to give one famous example, in the coronation of Aztec ruler Montezuma II, the participants ate the flesh of slaughtered war prisoners. They bathed in their blood while eating psilocybin mushrooms. Not exactly a peace and love scene. And psychedelics were also used in battle by many societies in Siberia, in the Amazon, and by the Zulu. And the Zulu people fortified their warriors with a mixture of cannabis and Amanita muscaria mushrooms in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, and reportedly it was pretty effective. And finally, we need to also talk about shamanism. And it's important to remember that next to white shamanism or healing shamanism, we also have black shamanism. And contrary to what you may think, it's not an aberration. Scholars of shamanism tell us that black shamanism is the other side of the same coin. Belligerent, offensive shamanism is as central and integral to the world of shamanism as the medical healing use of hallucinogens. So psychedelics don't necessarily turn you into a pacifist, peace-loving person. And finally, to give one last example, in the 1960s, psychedelics were assumed to liberate the mind from excessive compliance to the hypnotizing effects of culture. And the idea was that psychedelics make you think for yourself and question authority. They encourage you to reflect on the values of your culture, not to accept them as a given. The psychedelic counterculture perceived itself as opposing the conformist influences of mainstream culture. It was anti-war, it was anti-money, it had weird hairstyles, and Timothy Leary back then wrote a book called Make Your Own Religion. So basically, that was part of a general idea. Do your own thing. The authentic human being, the one who graduated from the psychedelic experience, will reject the norms and ideas the society tries to lay on him. And Terence McKenna said it best. He said, it doesn't matter if you're a Hasidic rabbi, if you're a Marxist-Leninist, or a rationalist scientist, psychedelics will make you question your worldview. And again, when you look at other societies, you find that the idea that that this is what psychedelics do is not universal at all. In traditional societies, hallucinogens are not used to question and destabilize social norms. On the contrary, they're used to instill the values of the society, to enhance social cohesion. They don't enhance a generation gap like in the 60s. They're seen as a generational bridge. They connect the young to the values of the society. They're not a countercultural technology, they're a pro-cultural technology. So I've laid out some of the ways in which the effects of psychedelics are far from uniform. And we can see that psychedelics indeed are crucially shaped by sense setting, not only on a personal level, but the sense setting of entire societies and cultures. But this dependency on the sense setting raises another crucial question that I'd like to discuss. So Timothy Leary tells us that 99% of the effects of psychedelics are the result of sense setting. Now, suppose we accept this. This leaves us with the question, where is the remaining 1%? And that is something that Leary doesn't really speak about. And like many others, including Stan Grof, Leary talks about psychedelics as non-specific agents, as agents that have no specific effect. The question, though, is, isn't it going too far? I mean, so much of psychedelic culture revolves around this celebration of a deeply venerated psychedelic experience. But if we accept that this argument that it's completely relative, completely dependent on sense setting, where does it leave us? If psychedelics are completely dependent on sense setting, then they have very little to claim for themselves. And instead they become completely transparent agent that only mirror and nothing else. And obviously this is not the case. And this was the dilemma that I was confronting as I was finishing the writing of my book. And this is what I call the paradox of sense setting. How can we extol the virtues of psychedelics, extol the virtues of the psychedelic experience, and at the same time argued that this experience is non-specific, that it's completely dependent on setting. So in American Trip, I try to give some kind of answer, some kind of solution to this question of what happens if we try to strip psychedelics from context. I mean, it's virtually impossible to do in any practical way, but we can try to at least do it conceptually. We can ask what stands at the core of the psychedelic experience. So in American Trip, I offer 3 such psychedelic core fundamentals that I'll describe now. And what makes these effects into core fundamentals is that these are core effects that repeat themselves in psychedelic experiences, regardless of set and setting, regardless of whether these experiences are healing or scarring, whether they're beautiful or disturbing. And they are fundamental principles that stand at the basis of the psychedelic experience, but we usually don't see these effects directly. And I compare them to a spotlight that's throwing light into the night sky. You can't see the light until it lands on another object. And then we tend to focus on the shape of the object rather than on the light itself. So the first core fundamental I want to suggest is intensity. The psychedelic experience is intense. Psychedelics intensify experiences. And this occurs through a mechanism of amplification of meaning, which is also the basic mechanism of setting. So why do setting even matter so much with psychedelics? I mean, why do we speak about it? Because we could say expectation, intention, environment, all these things are always important, right? They're important in any situation in life, basically. But they become particularly crucial in the psychedelic experience because under a psychedelic substance, everything is amplified, everything is augmented. So a pleasant experience can become ecstatic, a passing anxiety can become full-blown paranoia. So to experience the world through the psychedelic prism means to experience the world with higher intensity. Intensified colors, intensified sounds, intensified feelings, intensified insights, intensified relationships. And this is why psychedelic experiences seem so magical. They're like a dream. It's also why ordinary reality can seem dull in comparison, because it doesn't have the same level of intensity. So when we read the literature on psychedelics, through this prism, we find that so many of the words that are regularly used to describe the psychedelic experience really go back to this one core fundamental. Psychedelics have been called amplifiers, magnifiers, augmenters. They're revealing, or mind manifesting of this intensification, raising suggestibility. All these words are regularly used to describe them, and they all go back to this fundamental property of intensification. So that's the primary core fundamental, and I want to introduce 2 other ones that accompany it. And the second one is the hyper-associative, hyperlinked nature of the psychedelic experience. So people sometimes say that psychedelics help us see how everything's connected. And in the psychedelic experience, it feels like that. And one thought leads to another thought. Together, there's a chain of hyper-associative, hyperlinked thoughts. And we also see this in the Imperial College brain scans that show that under psilocybin, the brain becomes connected. Areas of the brain that usually don't speak to one another suddenly speak with one another. And it also explains synesthesia, this experience of having different parts of the experience, like sight and sound, interrelate. So we see sound or we hear colors, hyperassociation. We find this hyper-associative element in synchronicities, in meaningful coincidences, like thinking about somebody and then getting a message from them a moment later. It's much easier to encounter or maybe recognize synchronicities on psychedelics because they induce this hyper-associative type of magical thinking. And the dark side of this equation emerges when this magical thinking becomes pathological. So the mind becomes busy linking things that don't have anything to do with one another. And this leads to paranoid thinking, which is basically another genre of psychedelic hyper-associative thinking. So that's the second core fundamental, which is uh, active both on positive and negative levels in experiences with psychedelics. And finally, the third core fundamental is the sinuous boundary dissolving effects of these agents. And some of you might recall Terence McKenna often said that psychedelics are boundary dissolving agents. This is what they do. And we know this very well from psychedelic aesthetics. They often have these sinuous lines, dissolved boundaries, and we can actually find the same thing in music. If you think about the popular effects of psychedelic music in the 60s, the wah-wah pedal, wah-wah-wah, the reverb, delay, all these effects work by dissolving the boundaries of sound. And you can see this same boundary dissolving effect on the psychological level, leading to experiences that can get pathologized sometimes as depersonalization, as ego dissolution. But at the same time, if you look at them from the positive side, they stand at the basis of the mystical experience and the experience of unity, dissolved boundaries. So these are the my three proposed core fundamentals of psychedelics, three elements that are not dependent on sense setting. You can find them in all types of experiences with psychedelics. You can find them in mentally retarding and in mentally enhancing experiences. You can find traces of them in different psychedelic media, in psychedelic music, in art, in spirituality, in philosophy, in literature. And you can think about these three core fundamentals as guiding principles for thinking about psychedelic experiences. So I don't intend to suggest them as a final account of the effects of psychedelics, but I do hope that they prove useful and that they can join other attempts that we've seen in recent years to arrive at some kind of unified theory of psychedelic action. And now I want to get to the last part of my talk and examine how all of these insights translate into our world, into social life, into issues like drug policy reform. And I've described the psychedelic experience as something that's always framed by society, by culture, by historical time. And sure enough, since the 60s, the psychedelic experience went through different shifts and turns. In the 70s, psychedelics, people turned away from psychedelics and in favor of other more hedonic drugs like cocaine. And when they did take psychedelics, they took them in lower doses. And in comparison with the 60s, the experiences were less about spirituality and politics and more about enjoyment, a normalized part of life. In the 80s, we had the drug war at its peak, and use of psychedelics plummeted. America saw a rise of invigorated conservatism, materialism. But then in the 1990s, we've seen a resurgence of psychedelics that was mediated through new cultural scenes, the psytrance scene, the plant medicine scene, and these scenes did a lot to inform the experiences of psychedelic users. And another very positive development that we're seeing in recent years is this growth of a new culture of sense setting. So this is a culture that basically wants to educate about sense setting, that wants to improve sense setting for users. And I'm talking now about the second level of sense setting, the individual level. So how can we minimize harm and maximize benefit for psychedelic um, uh, by harnessing these basic principles of sense setting, like honing your intention, arranging your space, having the right attitude, so on and so forth. And we can see this movement in many places, in the safe zone movement. We can, in these organizations that work in festivals and help people that go through challenging experiences with psychedelics. And these use the principles of sense setting. We see this in volunteer-based websites that provide online trip sitting and integration services for people that are having difficult trips. We see this in an growing mini industry, maybe turning into an industry of integration coaches, of psychedelic trainings, books and manuals and websites that guide people on how to create safe, supportive sense setting for psychedelic experience. So our culture is in many ways much more psychedelically literate than it was in the past, through this new culture of sense setting. However, I believe that in order to fully gain from this growing awareness of sense setting, we need to think even more systematically on a fundamental collective level. And this level relates not just to psychedelics, but to many other types of drugs, because really the concept of sense setting is not just limited to psychedelics, it's much broader. And over the years, we've seen this concept getting imported to studies of other drugs, and it turns out that the effects of these other drugs are also very dependent on the scent and the setting. And I'll give one very famous example from psychology. In the 1970s, psychologist Bruce Alexander decided to challenge some of the classic experiments that showed that drugs like morphine and cocaine are addictive. And what these classic experiments did was that they gave lab animals free access to drugs and showed that when given this free access, animals quickly develop a drug-using habit. And what Alexander argued was that this kind of research was invalid because these were lab animals. So they were kept alone in small cages, and they were basically lonely, they were bored. So that obviously makes you much more likely to find drugs attractive. So maybe it was not just the drug alone, maybe it was also the environment that was making these animals addicted. So what Alexander did is he and his team built this new, nicer, more hospitable environment. And this place was designed to be heaven for rats. It had social contact, it had toys for rats, small corners to rest in, mating opportunities, and they called it Rat Park. And they repeated the classic experiments in these contexts, and they found that the results were very different. So the rats in Rat Park did not get addicted like the rats in solitary cages. They did not develop compulsive habits of use. They did not die from overdoses. And in fact, they preferred water to morphine solution. Even when researcher put sugar into the mix, these lab animals still preferred the water. So this was proof that morphine wasn't necessarily addictive itself. It was the setting that was making drugs irresistible to these lab animals. And this finding was later replicated by other teams with other drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine. And in every case, they found it's not the drug that's addictive by itself, it's the environment that shapes the effects of the drug. And that explains really well why disadvantaged populations are more likely to get addicted to drugs. Because if you live in an urban slum, if you're basically prospectless and bored out of your mind, it's much easier to get addicted. And the best example to prove this point is the example of American soldiers returning from Vietnam. In the 60s, the American army had a huge problem of heroin addiction in Vietnam. And it's estimated that about 20% of American soldiers were addicted to heroin at the time, and the army did try to provide treatments to help them recover, but they had very little success. And when these soldiers returned to the US, people thought it would be a catastrophe, but it turns out 88% of these people stopped using heroin. So what happened? Well, they didn't go to any fancy rehabilitation clinic. It turns out all that happened is that they spontaneously gave up the habit by changing the setting. And if you think about it, it's not very dissimilar from the Red Park experiment. The setting of the Vietnam War was characterized by boredom, by isolation, by terror, by feelings of purposelessness. And as long as these soldiers were in Vietnam, in this setting, heroin was very attractive. But once they were out of that setting and back to their normal lives, then they could keep the habit without even giving too much effort. So this is just one example among many of how sense setting is crucial, not just for psychedelics, but for many other types of drugs, and how it shapes not just psychedelic experiences, but really things that we usually think about as quite definite and not up for debate in terms of drug effects, like drug addiction, like drug overdoses. We don't think these are things that have anything to do with sense setting, but turns out they're very responsive to changes in sense setting. And when you take all of this together, it leads to several interesting directions that I want to suggest as I'm closing this talk. So first, on a personal level, I think this can be an invitation to consider the ways that our own psychedelic experiences are shaped by culture, by the culture we live in, by the social environment we live in, and how my society and my culture shape how I view and experience psychedelics. Secondly, on a social level, this leads us to the realization that drug policy has been barking up the wrong tree. We've been focusing on which drugs we want to prohibit, when really the question is less about the particular drug and more about the context. So rather than focusing on the types of drugs people use, drug policy should focus more on how people use them. And this, I think, is where our drug policy needs to turn at the moment. So we've been persecuting drug users in ways that make sense setting worse, that actually increase drug harms. And what we need instead is a drug policy that educates users on how to develop healthier relationships with psychoactives. And today, drug education paints a very distorted view of drugs as demons, and this creates a harmful, a vulgarized type of sense setting. So an alternative, progressive approach to drug education, it will recognize that the state has a responsibility, a fundamental responsibility for the welfare of drug users, because it plays a major part in shaping cultural sense setting that end up determining the outcomes of these experiences with drugs. And a progressive approach to drug education will recognize that since drugs are not going away, what matters most is not just the how much drugs people use or what kinds of drugs people use, but how they use them. And this progressive drug policy recognizes that issues of sense setting are crucial to help people develop safe, meaningful relationships with mind-altering substances and avoid abusive, harmful relationships. And these kinds of skill sets are badly needed. And I want to invite us all to imagine a world where learning about drugs, about ways of controlling their effects, their benefits, their harms, when all of these things are part of the basic education of every citizen, instead of what's currently being passed as drug education. So that will be a good point to close my talk, and I hope I've given you some food for thought. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take your questions.
All right, thank you so much. That was a great talk and a lot of really interesting points. And so now I think we have a little over half an hour to open things up for questions. So just like we do in some of in our past sessions, if you can use the raise hand function, and then Jordan and I will be able to call on you and unmute you. And then if you feel comfortable, if you wouldn't mind turning your video on so we can see your smiling faces for the questions, I think that'd help a lot and contribute to the discussion. So with that, I'll go ahead and open it up if anyone has any questions. And also, if you would like, you can type questions into the chat and we can read them for you as well. It's another way to get your questions to us. So. So I see one here from David Matai. So I'll unmute you and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ido. I really enjoyed that talk. I'm a psychiatry resident in Houston, Texas. And one thing I was thinking about just hearing your points was, you sort of alluded to this, but this culture of medicine and this culture of psychiatry too, maybe very specifically. And I'm wondering how you think about that interplay. And I'm thinking even of my very short med management appointments, thinking about what are the basic constituent factors that we need for a positive outcome and effect here. How are we going to shift as a culture to accommodate these new treatments too? And how do you think about that aspect of culture?
Right, as it relates to psychiatry too, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, and I really think that the integration of psychedelics into medicine at this moment is something that really does demand this kind of reorientation from psychiatry, or at least from psychedelic psychiatry, in different ways. I mean, some of the issues that I deal with is this whole question of placebo and how we should treat placebo, because what other people call placebo, we call sense setting, and is an integral part of therapy that makes it much more effective. And on the other, and so that's one thing that psychiatry needs to integrate, in the sense that for many years, psychiatry has gone in the direction of becoming, eyeing the hard sciences, trying to become, moving away from psychotherapy and from the more human skills towards other more pharmacology-oriented skills. And obviously, psychedelics are psychopharmacological tools. So that's obviously a huge part of what we're talking about. But the other aspects, we can't deny them anymore, or we can't just shove them away, push them away. And they're crucial, because if we want these agents to be effective and beneficial and not harmful, and to achieve these spectacular results that we're seeing in the clinical trials, this depends on the people that will be mediating them to patients, that who will be administering them, putting the emphasis on these human-to-human contact qualities, because otherwise we're really setting ourselves up for failure. So I'm wondering whether the whole question of where psychedelics are going, the medical model is obviously just one of the models, and there are other things that are happening and that will happen as we're seeing alongside this medical model, like the spiritual and like recreational and creative and microdosing and whatnot. But for the medical model to work, and it has a huge potential, a huge medical potential, it has to come to terms with the fact that setting is crucial, that you can't obliterate it and say we keep on to our older ways. Or I'm sure, of course, that this doesn't pertain to all psychiatry, definitely not all psychiatrists. But I'm talking about this more general kind of sense that I'm getting from some of the discourse in psychiatry, and we need to think about how these aspects are really crucial, because otherwise, I think it just won't work. Because really, more than any kind of medical diploma, what people really cherish in these very susceptible, very vulnerable, meaningful experiences is just feeling that they're there with somebody that they can fully trust and be with. And this was also one of the challenges of psychedelic psychiatry of the 1950s, which is why they achieved this kind of psychotomimetic, why they believed these experiences induce psychosis, until these other people came and said, hey, we need to pay attention to this setting, and then it becomes therapeutic. Thank you for this question. I hope I haven't been too glib on the subject.
No, that was great. Thank you. All right, our next question comes from the chat, from Ido Hartogsohn. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So I oversee clinical trials, and I'm currently working on a trial with psilocybin in depression. My question is, what do you think about the use of guidance manuals in these clinical trials to try to help patients to be in the right setting or mood?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know these manuals, to their very minute details, but I think the idea of having these guidelines is definitely it's important, and it's something that we need in order to have some kind of standardization of knowing what of sharing of information, of knowledge that was acquired by this therapeutic community, of knowing what we're talking about. And at the same time, of course, it's important to not be too rigid in our conception of how healing with psychedelics looks like, because one thing that's for sure is that the right setting can be different for different kinds of people, and we know that if you just take the shamanic setting that was used for millennia to heal people in other cultural contexts, and you just import it into our culture, it might work for some people, but not for everybody. And so I think these manuals are I believe they're beneficial in general for this psychotherapeutic culture as it's growing and developing at the moment. And at the same time, we need to keep an eye on really just having a feel for patients, for the situation, and not not becoming too stuck on anything just because it's in the books.
Thanks, Ido. Yeah, I think that question gets at this really interesting point about, what is the ideal setting to use in clinical trials. And I think that's something the field's grappling with, is what given the huge impact of setting, what do you actually want to standardize, and what's appropriate to test. And I always said, it's, in my opinion, it depends on, is it a trial with the intention of treatment, or is it, is the intention more around just gathering neurobiological data? But
yeah,
have you been consulted with by any research groups about what giving guidance towards what setting should be implemented in research contexts?
Not so much. I've been having conversations around these topics, but not in any formal ways. But I think about Leary, who back in the 60s suggested that in his paper, responses to psilocybin in a supportive setting, he suggested that, that we need to describe the setting that we're using in any experiment, and also be clear that these responses, results are true and accurate for that particular setting. So obviously that demands of us, that complicates a lot of that complicates the questions of drug research and psychopharmacology, but I think it opens up a whole new terrain that that's navigatable, that's important, and that we can't allow ourselves to just ignore, because really the situation with psychedelics is they just confront us with these questions that have been around the whole time. Only now with psychedelics, they've become pretty much, they've become something that we can't push away. And yeah.
Great. So Lolly, do you want to come off mute and ask your questions? And just sent you a, yeah.
Hi, yeah, my name is Lolly B. I'm a mental health professional, and I really appreciate you bringing this into awareness. I myself am an Indigenous person from a homeland where psychedelic medicine has been traditionally practiced, and I also work a lot with the Native population here in North America. And so what I've learned in my overlapping of these fields is that beyond set and setting, the wisdom that the facilitator needs to have, it's not something that can be taught in a book, standardized across a curriculum. So what I'm noticing, or what I'm wondering around, is how can we bridge this gap between those space holders and people who carry the lineage of generations around how to appropriately hold space for people going through these experiences, and moving it into this colonized academic field, because yes, it is beneficial to people, but where is that level between, okay, we can take this medicine and figure out what works for us, versus like bringing in those experts and asking them humbly, how can we do this in the best way, and just like building that bridge and gap so that we don't, because there already are people who've done this for millennia. We don't have to start at square one. So thank you so much.
Right, thank you for this question. Well, I think partly this was what I was getting at in my first answer to David, which is that really there does seem to exist this basic disaccord or discord between these two. On the one hand, we have a mental health establishment that's very very focused on objective measures and on these different and that's nested, and that's even a greater problem in these huge for-profit contexts where these medicines are liable to get involved inside this again for-profit context, and when you put this into therapy, and when you once these very nuanced, very sensitive moments become enmeshed in this greater culture where mental health is really sometimes not really about people's mental health, where healing has this whole other meaning, then this really has the potential of sabotaging the potential for what these agents can really do. And at the same time, as you said, we have all of these traditions, and we have indigenous traditions, and we also have people that have been working underground, some of them for many years, that have lots of skills but don't necessarily have the right kinds of papers. And if you ask a lot of people, again, what they're wishing for is more the person that they feel that they can, so that they can naturally and confidently connect with on a purest level. And at the same time, obviously the entire system cannot just accept that in it's not built to accept these kinds of criteria. It's built around papers and diplomas and so on and so forth. So you know, it's such a big question, and one of the more intractable ones. Well, I hope not intractable, but it will demand, and I'm thinking about this amazing moment that we're currently in which psychedelics are really shooting out of the, they're really breaking through. And we're seeing interest from all these new players, but at the same time, we're kind of suspicious about some of these new players and what their motives are that enter at the last moment. And so there's a strong need for a dialogue of the sort that you referred to, I think, and that will demand some goodwill on all sides, but mostly on the side of the mental health establishment, and or at least the part of it that wants to work with these agents. And I wonder, and I really hope that that some kind of alliance can be formed where these kinds of issues are recognized, and where people, maybe through some kind of alliance where clients can know that they're approaching people who have gone through this more holistic kind of training, that have this more holistic awareness and sensibility. Well, that's really crucial. Thank you.
Thanks, Ido, for addressing that. It's such an important and difficult area. Let's go to Deborah. Deborah.
Hi, thanks. It's a pleasure to hear about your research. So you spoke a little bit about how an awareness of set and setting has led to researchers, questioning the effects of other drugs. So the Rat Park example, which I loved. My question is about whether set and setting as a process or a protocol or whatever we want to call it, how has that affected like the physical elements of hospital design more broadly? So I'm thinking of like interior design in hospitals or clinics, like the furniture placement, the decorations, because I know a lot of these manuals, talk about, not having a telephone in the room, or having certain tapestries or paintings. So I'm kind of curious if you've seen evidence of, I guess I'm looking for evidence that set and setting has positively impacted, treatment settings more broadly. And I know Jordan has been thinking about this too, with like what should be standardized in treatment setting.
Right. Well, one of the examples, really fascinating examples that I had as part of the book and that ended up outside because it was actually from Canada, was that you might have heard of Humphrey Osmond and Abram Hoffer, who were leading the alcohol trials. Trials with LSD for alcohol addiction in Saskatchewan in the 50s. And they had this architect that went through this psychedelic experience and came up with this new design for actually moving through this whole psychomimetic paradigm. We're thinking about how psychedelics can make you more sensitive for what kind of cues do people that experience mental health problems go through, or psychotic effects and so on. So he redesigned an entire hospital, or designed an entire hospital based on these insights. And there's actually a nice article you can read about it from a book from 1970, edited by Aronson, about this how this experience of having this LSD experience in a hospital led this architect to come up with this new architectural design for mental health hospitals. So that's the most most remarkable example that I know of, and there's been different attempts to kind of set up psychedelic therapy rooms, and I think a lot of times these attempts run into the problem of these trials having to take place in hospitals, which creates where you have these certain strict rules about what's allowed and what's not allowed, and certain stuff that you can't do or you must do. So, and I would hope that in the future, next to all of these new professions that we're seeing, like I don't know, like psychedelic integration coaches and psychedelic I don't know advisors or whatnot, then we maybe have psychedelic designers that that work outside of hospitals, maybe in some kinds of retreat centers that would be constructed, informed by these realizations about how to build a space that allows us to hold a space for a psychedelic experience.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. So I had a follow-up question. I was wondering so I really like your idea of collective set and setting, and I've appreciated you bringing that so much into the discussion. And I was wondering if you could shed some light on how you think about that sort of globally today, and like how the collective set and setting might differ between the US and Israel and other places you might be familiar with. And yeah.
Right. Well, first of all, I think collectively, there's this greater professional risk, in a sense, that psychonauts these days are facing, I think, because with these issues of climate change and authoritarian leaders and algorithms monitoring our everyday behavior online, I think all of this stuff is really conducive to paranoia. And it's something that we have to deal with, that people 10 or 15 years ago didn't have to deal with in the same way. And so that's a new kind of professional risk. And at the same time, there's differences in the setting between different places. And in Israel, I can say that the psychedelic community is somewhat different than in many other parts of the Western world. And for example, the whole issue of psychedelics and this kind of humanist pacifist worldview. While on the other one hand, you have the core of the psychedelic community that definitely stands by these values. In Israel, you also have a very strong psytrance scene, where a large portion of the participants are people around 20 who often come back from the military for the weekend, partying with psychedelics and going back to the same system. So in this sense, you can see, and you also have in recent years ayahuasca circles where settlers from the West Bank or just ultra-Orthodox people drink ayahuasca and have this completely different kind of take on this whole experience, which is more Orthodox, more Jewish, perhaps less universal. So in that sense, I think I can see from my position here, and again, the core of the Israeli psychedelic community is aligned with a lot of what's happening in the States and in a lot of other parts of the world. But you can see how also this whole culture is mediated or is transformed by the national culture, by the national circumstances, and ends up producing different kinds of experiences and values.
All right, I think we've got a lot of hands raised. So I'm not sure we'll get to everyone's questions, but I think next, I think Alejandro Molina, you've had your hand raised for quite a while.
Thanks for the talk. Appreciate it. My question kind of has to do with, you know, this new generation of researchers. I get the impression that a lot of these researchers are motivated by some sort of personal psychedelic experience that they've had. I also seems like there's like a huge avoidance of discussing personal psychedelic experiences in this field due to stigma, you know, professional considerations. I'm wondering, you know, if in your studies, if that's the case everywhere, if that's a uniquely American phenomenon that, you know, no one likes to talk about it, no one likes to share, because I see that as a way of reducing stigma. You know, the people like the Roland Griffiths of the world came out and said, you know, I had this experience when I was 20 years old, it changed my life, you know, it might kind of open up the dialogue a little more.
Right, and I mean, and even, I mean, it's also different when you speak about things that happened when I was 20 years old and still leave that space when, okay, it's been 40 years, and you speak about, okay, it's part of my life, it's part of who I am, of my identity. Well, you know, I haven't really looked and compared different countries, but I think this kind of sentiment is still pretty prevalent. I hope that it will change with the time. I have to say, for myself, I've been writing about psychedelics for some almost 15 years, and at some point it becomes pretty tiring to just, you know, put all that aside and kind of like and deny that. And I don't know if I've come out of the psychedelic closet, but sometimes you find yourself still in some way still hiding there in certain situations. And you know, I think that, as you said, it's important not only for destigmatizing, but really to have this more honest conversation that will actually has the potential to really bring us the conversation forward. So and really the stigma is diminishing all the time, and actually researchers are really, as you might have implied, are the last ones maybe to really tell about their experiences, because they seem to think that this they're expected to keep this professional, and the professional means not being blind to this experience and just approaching it from the outside. Well, that's just absurd to think that you're more professional if you don't have the experience of what you're talking about and researching. So yeah, I really hope that changes, and I imagine it's up to each and every one of us who's doing this work to kind of grapple with it and find the ways of coming up front. Yeah.
All right, so probably have time for a few more questions. I see Zanjir's hand has been up for a while. So.
Hi, thank you for the talk. You've mentioned that we have some idea of what's going on at the neurological level to cause the fundamental hyperassociation. I was wondering if we have sort of begun to try to understand what the physical correlates of the other two core fundamentals might be.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I'm thinking about. I mean, it's funny because at the physical level, it's something I think that a lot of it is something that we can experience subjectively, but on objective measures, in the same way that the Imperial College brain scans show you that the brain on psilocybin is more hyperlinked. I haven't really gone, or I haven't discovered yet any um, any correlations. I mean, the intensity I imagine would be evident in the kind of serotonergic bath that your brain is going through in this situation. But yeah, that'd be interesting to think about this experience of example, for example, these dissolved boundaries that we experience as we feel the body being dissolved, dismantled, and how might that relate to something that's happening on a more fundamental biological physical level. But I don't have anything concrete to offer on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ido. John Hartberg, go ahead.
Hey there. Thanks for the talk. That was great. I just had a question in regards to, speaking of psychedelics as being destabilizing or not destabilizing to cultures. Some of those examples that came up, many of the examples we look at for psychedelics in other cultures are cultures that have had relationships with psychedelics for long periods of time. And so they're accustomed to them, whereas when psychedelics enter into a culture such as our kind of Western framework, they've acted as a destabilizing force in some setting. So I guess my question is, when psychedelics enter into a culture, are they then inherently kind of destabilizing forces, or do we have examples of times where psychedelics have come into a culture or a smaller subculture or a group of people, and they kind of go with the current paradigm and don't act as disruptors, and so then you can imagine after we have this hopeful relationship with our future psychedelics, we'll grow accustomed to that, and then they won't be as destabilizing in the long term.
Right, and I mean this destabilization is not necessarily a bad thing, because it could also be being more critical or more independent in thinking. But as you say, I think that's a good point on these older cultures, traditional cultures versus modern cultures. And it's interesting to think about how that reflects the setting of those cultures. I mean, because those traditional cultures are to begin with more conform and uniform than our culture. So perhaps when it enters the culture that's more divided and multiplicitous in its character, then this also has the potential of reproducing that, of reflecting that. At the same time, I think you can see that even in the 1960s, psychedelics did work for some parts of the culture, of the counterculture, to also gather people around certain values, certain ideas. And if I'm thinking about today's ayahuasca religions, ayahuasca religions, I'm talking about Brazilian ayahuasca religions now, they're things that emerged in the last century, so they're pretty modern, and they also get to Western contexts, and over there in Western Santo Daime churches, for example, or União de Vegetal churches, so they do end up, I think, enhancing the cohesiveness of at least this certain group or subculture. So over there, we can certainly see that it works in this way. And I think you can also see this also in a sense in a psytrance party, or in these kinds of environments. Well, sure, on the one hand you have this berserkness of people just going in these very different extravagant styles and whatnot, but at the same time you also have this at the end of the morning after a long night of dancing, or you have this you do have this experience of the growth of this more social cohesion and understanding. Yeah.
Thanks, Ido. I just want to throw out one thing that your paper actually stimulated some thought and discussion around, which was that actually cannabis was part of the original formulation of set and setting, or from historically, I guess. And I think it's interesting that cannabis sometimes gets left out of this set and setting conversation, especially now with broader legalization happening and more studies happening that that look at the effects of cannabis on cognition and its therapeutic potential. But there's rarely ever any discussion around set and setting in cannabis research. I'm just wondering if you have any comment about that.
Yeah, and as we said, sense setting are always helpful. They're always, they can be crucial, and with cannabis, that's definitely the case. I mean, if you're not used to cannabis and it's a very strong psychoactive, then having it in the wrong kind of setting can really mess up with your mind. And I mean, if you're with the wrong kind of people or environment or situation, it can really mess up with your mind. And I'm thinking, as a counterexample, you have in the Santo Daime ayahuasca religion that I mentioned before, you have a whole ritual around the ceremonial use of cannabis, which is called Santa Maria in this context. And so Santa Maria is grown in a certain way, and it's consumed in certain circumstances, and smoking 3 puffs at a time, doing specific intentions in each of the puffs, and then basically either meditating or singing songs praising Santa Maria, praising cannabis. So I can say that this kind of setting, I mean, most of us, people think about cannabis as this kind of like, more like a daily thing. So we don't need to think about sense setting. But when you move out of our usual kind of the common kinds of situations in which cannabis is consumed, then you see that it can be really something else. And it's really radical that when you consume cannabis, for a person that's consumed cannabis throughout their lives, and consuming it in this ritual manner can really bring out very different kinds of experiences and really be quite empowering. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. I have to apologize. It's 1:30, and I know we have more questions, and I know it's been such an interesting discussion, but I think in the interest of everyone's time, we'll have to end here. So I'd like to thank Dr. Hartogsohn for being here. It was a great talk, very interesting. I think there's so much here and so much more to learn and explore. If anyone is interested in that, you have the links to both the video museum and to his book, American Trip. So just a big round of applause from YPSG for being here. Thank you, and look forward to talking more in the future.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
Wonderful. And thanks everyone for attending.
Take everyone off mute for 1 sec. We can all express our gratitude here. So if anyone wants.
Thanks, Ido.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, it was great. Thank you.
See you later.
See ya.